Hey folks, David Stewart here. Hope you guys are having a great day. It's time for our long-awaited analysis of Final Fantasy III, originally released way back in 1990 for the Nintendo Famicom at the end of the lifespan of that particular console. I mentioned Famicom, not Nintendo Entertainment System or NES, because it was never released outside of Japan until there was a ground-to-ceiling remake of it done for the Nintendo DS in 2006. All following versions of the game were based on this 2006 Nintendo DS remake, including the version that I played for this playthrough and this analysis, which is the 2012 PlayStation Portable version, which I should mention before I go any further is disappearing off of digital stores in July. After that time, the only way to get the PSP version of this game will be to buy a Japanese-only physical release. Luckily, it does have the English script if you are buying the Japanese release, but you will not be able to buy Western or European versions of the PlayStation Portable version once it disappears off of the PSP store. That's happening in July. Not to worry though, if you happen to miss that window, you can still get this version of the game for mobile platforms including Android and iOS. There was even at one point a Windows Phone version of it that you can get, and the Steam version or the PC version is also a port of this 2006 Nintendo DS remake. It was apparently also available for the Ouya, though I don't know if you can still get it in 2021. Before I go any further, let me talk very briefly about some of the differences between the various versions that you can buy. I mentioned all the versions that you can buy right now are based on that 2006 Nintendo DS remake. If you're wanting to play the original Famicom version, it is Japanese only, unless you want to use a fan translation or a translated script, like printed out on a piece of paper, which you can actually do. The game has been rebuilt from the ground up. It's very different from the original Famicom release in a large number of ways. The first and most obvious one is the change in aesthetics. The original Final Fantasy III was released for the Famicom and thus is an 8-bit 2D game, and the new one, released in 2006, is a full 3D remake. It has 3D environments, 3D character models, and generally has a completely different look to the original. Because that Famicom version is Japanese only, most likely you're going to be wanting to play this 2006 remake anyway. There are a couple of little differences between the various versions that are out there. So if you're going to play the original 2006 Nintendo DS version of the game, you should be aware that there are pieces of content that are locked behind this little Mognet service, which required an internet connection and is actually no longer usable. So you won't be able to unlock the Onion Knight class, and certain things will not be obvious for what you're supposed to do. What the Mognet was is that you were supposed to send messages and things to other people on your Nintendo DS. That service isn't available anymore. In all versions after that 2006 version, the Mognet service has been replaced by a Moogle that you can just talk to in town, and as you go through the story, it unlocks various messages that you can read and will unlock the quest for you to get the Onion Knight class. If you're going to play it on the Nintendo DS, be aware that you don't really need the Onion Knight class. It's really not a very good class unless you're going to get all of your characters up to level 99. Which is going to take a lot of grinding and is not at all necessary to complete the game. So you're actually not missing out on all that much, even if the Mognet service is not going to work for you. Other than that, the main difference between the Nintendo DS version and all versions which followed is that there's no second screen, so all of that information has been placed in a more traditional overlay interface on a single screen. So if you're playing the Android and the iOS versions, all the information that was on that second screen, it's just going to be overlaid underneath your characters like you would see on a traditional JRPG. I will also mention that if you are playing the Steam version, which I also have, it does have ultra-wide monitor support, so you could play this game in 21:9 if you really wanted to. I will say, though, that because of the more primitive 3D graphics, I don't think you gain a whole lot by playing this game on the PC. In fact, I think it actually looks better on smaller screens because you don't notice the low resolution textures and the low poly character models quite as much. Now, besides the graphics, there are some very big gameplay changes from the original Famicom version. The original Famicom version, similar to Final Fantasy 1 and 2, you could encounter large groups of monsters, 9, sometimes even more monsters that I think could go off the edge of the screen. That has been completely changed so that you are only going to encounter a maximum of 3 monsters in this remake. That affects a lot of things. Those 3 monsters are buffed. In other words, they're stronger and more challenging to make up for the fact that you are not facing 9 monsters at a time. But as a result, I think the emphasis on the various jobs that you'll be playing, and these are basically the classes that you can choose from, the emphasis tends to really be towards melee in this version of the game, and magic is just not quite as powerful as it was in the original Famicom version of the game. Where you acquire the various jobs is also different in the DS remake. For instance, you no longer acquire the Sage and the Ninja jobs by completing the final optional dungeon, otherwise known as Eureka, but rather you just get those as part of one of the crystals. The jobs in general have been completely reworked and tweaked to have a bigger difference between them and a little bit more utility in some cases, as well as a little bit of a reduced power for the Sage and the Ninja classes to compensate for the fact that you are not acquiring them by doing a challenge dungeon. You also have a job level and adjustment period that kicks in whenever you switch jobs to just give a little bit of a penalty to the player for constantly switching jobs so that you have to kind of be committed to one party setup for a longer period of time in order to maximize their power and efficiency. So anyway, I still recommend this 2006 remake. I think it's a great version of the game, and I think most people are going to enjoy it, whether you're going to play it on your Ouya or on your phone or on your PSP. I think you're going to have a pretty good time with this version of the game. Plenty of challenge to be had. I had plenty of game overs, and there's a lot of fun to be had trying out different class combinations. With that, let's go ahead and move into talking about the gameplay of Final Fantasy III. I like the gameplay of this. I think it has a lot of very engaging elements at all the different levels of gameplay. So at the micro level, you have the traditional Final Fantasy or JRPG format of encountering monsters randomly, and you have to figure out how to kill them without them killing you or doing too much damage to you. So you want to kill them as quickly and efficiently as possible. At the macro level, you have to manage your resources, particularly your mana. And in this game, mana is distributed very similar to how it was in Final Fantasy I. Rather than having a single number that represents your mana pool with different costs, you have mana for each spell level that you happen to acquire. And as you level up and as your job level increases, you get more of each of those, and you get more of each of those depending on which class you happen to choose. So at the macro level, it's about managing your mana, managing your health, managing your stock of items like potions and things like that, and deciding how you're going to efficiently use them to get through a dungeon. You can't save the game in the middle of a dungeon. You have to be able to get all the way through a dungeon before you quit, and that is really where the fun of the macro level is there. You also, at the macro level, are trying to raise the power level of your characters by buying items, buying magic, exploring the world to find different kinds of hidden power. Now, where I think this game really shines in terms of gameplay is at the meta level, the higher level, the game about the game, which involves how you're going to choose your party layout, what jobs you're going to assign to which party member in order to overcome really big challenges in the game or just maximize your efficiency as you play. So as you play through the story, you unlock various jobs. Each job has a different flavor to it, has a different strength and a different weakness, different abilities, access to different magic and different amounts of mana for each level of magic. You have some classes that can do black and white magic, some that can do white magic only, and you have to decide which character is going to do what as you unlock those jobs. You'll find as you play through the game and gain experience that certain jobs combine really well with certain other jobs, and you can do some really zany combinations. You can have a thief that steals items and a scholar which uses those items and gets double the effect from the items. You can run a bard and a healer, or you can run all red mages or something if you really wanted to. You can really come up with whatever class combination your heart desires. Very similar to the first Final Fantasy game, except that you don't have to make the decision when you begin the game. Rather, you can make the decision as you're playing the game. You can really experiment as much as you want. Now, the game is going to nudge you in certain directions or encourage you to try out different jobs as you play through by giving you equipment that is usable for those jobs. So you'll get newer, better equipment that maybe is usable for, say, a Dark Knight, and that's going to persuade you to switch one of your characters over into that class in order to use those better swords, do more damage, be more efficient, that sort of thing. There's even a couple of places where you have to have a certain job in order to proceed, like you may need to have access to the Toad spell to turn your entire party into toads, so you can go through a water level, or you may have to use the mini spell to turn all of your characters into little gnomes, so you can do the gnome level. There's things like that where having, say, a white mage available to cast those spells is very helpful. Not completely necessary, though, as you can actually use items to replace most of those spells, like the mallet can be used to shrink your characters down to the tiny size to go through tiny holes. And there's even a point where they strongly suggest that you should take a scholar job into a dungeon in order to determine the weakness of a final boss. This is actually not necessary. You can just fight that boss and kill him without ever having to use the analyze ability of a scholar. And I guess this is one of the downsides to the gameplay, is there's a number of jobs which just are very lackluster. They are not that fun to use, or they're not that viable in the long run. I mentioned Scholar. Lots of online discussions are going to tell you that Scholar is one of the worst classes in the game, but you could still use it if you really wanted to. Like I mentioned, it gets enhanced effect from using items, so you could have a thief that steals an item, have a scholar use that item. Really, there's no class that is completely useless, but some are definitely stronger than others. You also, especially as the game moves into the final dungeons, will see that certain classes are just not going to be as good for the late game play as others. This is mostly due to equipment limitations and things like that. And also you just end up with jobs that are just upgrades of other jobs. So the Devout is simply an upgrade from White Mage. Once you have the Devout class, you really don't need to use a White Mage again. Once you have the Black Belt class, you really don't need to use a Monk again. Once you have a Summoner, there's really no reason to have an Evoker. Since I know some people are going to ask, my final party in the World of Darkness ended up being a Knight, a Ninja, a Devout, and a level 99 Geomancer. I switched from Sage, which has access to Summon Magic, White Magic, Black Magic, very powerful spellcaster, switched over to Geomancer because Geomancer could actually spam damage limit spells every single turn without ever having to worry about mana. It was an absolute beast at the end of the game, combined with those two very strong melee classes in dual-wielding Knight, dual-wielding Ninja, and a Devout to just spam heals on the party. Worked out really, really well and made the World of Darkness not all that challenging. By the way, if you do get a job up to job level 99, you will be able to get a free legendary item from a character called the Legendary Smith, which roams around the world, and that legendary item will really give a strong boost to that particular class. The classes that I might recommend you try to get level 99 with are Geomancer, which it's kind of an odd class in that the magic is random, but it can be very powerful, especially in the final dungeon. Also, for consideration, I would say Thief, because Thief can use some very, very good end-game weapons and is just another melee character that can do a ton of damage every single round, as well as steal items, which is useful. Both of those classes you get fairly early in the game at either the first or second crystal, I don't remember which. So that means that you can just leave a character on that job and play through the game as you normally would, and you'll hit level 99 without having to do any grinding. I will say that because this game had lots of bonus dungeons and lots of optional content, which I chose to do, I really never had to grind except a very little bit right at the beginning in order to get my freelancer job levels enough to do the first dungeon without dying to the first couple of pulls. But other than that, no grinding. It was really a smooth leveling experience. My characters were generally gaining enough power for me to do the next challenge. There was a couple places where I did a challenge dungeon, got to the final boss and couldn't kill him, and had to come back later when I was a little bit stronger. But again, I didn't have to go out into the world and just grind to get levels in order to accomplish the next challenge, which is something that I was a little bit used to doing with the first two Final Fantasy games. Anyway, I give the gameplay an 8.5 out of 10. It's very fun, generally is interesting the whole way through the game. The only downside is some jobs are kind of not useful towards endgame or end up being dead, like the monk. And once you settle into a really effective playstyle, you tend to want to just stick with it and not do a whole lot different, which can make the game play just seem a little bit stale in certain parts of the game. But other than that, it was great, and I enjoyed the meta level aspects, in particular choosing my job and figuring out which one to level, what I was going to use in a particular dungeon in order to get past a certain boss or set of mobs. That was a lot of fun. So if there's any game designers listening, I think one of the easiest ways to create a lot of engagement for a player is just to give them lots of options for how they can overcome a challenge. And I think that adds to some of the replayability of a game like Final Fantasy III, because each time you play the game, similar to Final Fantasy I, you can try out a different arrangement or a different set of strategies to overcome the challenges. All right, moving on to production and aesthetics and music. I want to address first the big monkey in the room when it comes to the graphics, and that is the reality that the low polygon count, low texture models and environments made for the Nintendo DS way back in 2006 really haven't aged all that well. But they haven't aged nearly as bad as I thought they would, and they have not aged as badly as the models for Final Fantasy IV Remake, which was also for the Nintendo DS. And I think this is because they approached the art style with a more chibi aesthetic. The characters are not intended to be photorealistic, rather they are cartoonish. They're kind of rounded, they have large hips and rounded bodies, they have little stubs instead of hands and feet, and they have big cute eyes and mouths. So comparing this to the Final Fantasy IV Remake, I think it was a very good choice to go with the chibi aesthetic. So with that out of the way, in general, I appreciated the art style for what it was. Yes, it's a little low res, but I do like the way the characters look. I like their attack animations. I like the animations of most of the monsters. I really like their big expressions during the little cutscenes, and I especially like all the different costumes that the characters have when you change their jobs. One of the fun things about this game is each time you change the job, the character puts on armor or clothes that approximate that job. And because each character model is different and each character is a little different, they all look a little different depending on what they're wearing. My favorite was probably the Refia character, who is the female character, because her little hairstyle would change with every single job. Sometimes she'd have pigtails, sometimes she'd have some other kind of hairstyle. A little more variety with that particular character than with the other three male characters. Besides the character models, the environments generally look pretty good because you are viewing them really zoomed out, so you're not going to notice as much of the low-res textures as when you are looking at the close-up character models in a battle. And there is a ton of variety of environments, lots of different color palettes used. There's a level that's entirely made out of gold, and you have the characters reflecting off the floor, which is quite nice to look at. So in general, I think the aesthetic sensibilities of the game are pretty good. I would give them maybe a 7 out of 10. That includes some of the rather poor aging of the lower quality 3D. In general, it's going to be on par with most PlayStation 1 games, a little bit awkward, kind of feeling like that early 3D, but with a better sense of art considering it was made in 2006 rather than 1996. A lot of the artists had been able to adjust and figure out what kind of things were going to look good within the limitations of something like the Nintendo DS. Next, I'd like to talk briefly about sound and music. In general, I really like the sound, especially of the newer versions. It's much improved from the original DS, which had to use compressed sounds. So you're going to get a high-quality soundtrack experience and high-quality sound effects if you are getting any of the newer versions, which the PlayStation Portable is one of those newer versions. There is no voice acting in this game, unlike the Final Fantasy IV remake that they did for the DS the following year, I think in 2007. So you're just going to be reading the dialogue, but that's fine because to me that's part of a traditional JRPG experience. Really, anything prior to Final Fantasy X, that is a standard experience, so that's fine for me. Nobuo Uematsu, who contributed the music to the previous two titles, also contributes the music to this and to the DS version. The DS version has a rearrangement of the original score from the Famicom, and I do think it's a little bit better than the 8-bit original. There's definitely a lot of charm to the 8-bit original, but using the more rich, modern MIDI sounds rather than the synth sounds of the NES, I think gives the score a lot more depth. There's a lot of variety with the score. There's different themes depending on which airship you happen to be in, and I think it really fits that. The only, I guess, downside to the score is that there's one battle theme that plays for most of the entire game, and because this game is so epic and so expansive and long, you get a little bit tired of hearing that same music over and over again, but luckily the battles are usually not that long, so you don't have to listen to it for too long at a given time, and the encounter rate is fairly low compared to the previous two Final Fantasy games and Final Fantasy IV, the original version of Final Fantasy IV, that is. So you're not having to constantly battle and hear the same battle music over and over again. Rather, it's spaced out a little bit in the dungeon because of the lower encounter rate. The remake was actually produced by one of the original designers, Ryosuke Aiba, and I think that connection to the original project shows in this version of the remake. It's very much in the spirit of the original version and very much is trying to achieve, I guess, a finer quality rendition of what the original was doing on the limited hardware of the Famicom. In fact, I've heard that one of the reasons that Final Fantasy III never got, say, an SNES version or a PlayStation version is that the game was so large it didn't really transition well to any other platform until they had enough memory and space to completely remake the game for the Nintendo DS. Now, I don't know if that's actually true or not. That's just a rumor, but it is a fairly large game, and there was a lot of attention to detail throughout the game, and I do appreciate that. All right, let's talk a little bit about story, because this is something that lots of people care about with the Final Fantasy game. Similar to the first two Final Fantasy games, the main purpose of the story is to move the player through the various set pieces of the game, letting them see and explore new areas of content, new environments, and face new and more interesting challenges. We are not at the place of Final Fantasy yet where you have a strong and extremely coherent narrative that pushes you through the entirety of the game. That really begins with the next entry in the series, Final Fantasy IV. That being said, in general, I think it's a very good story, and I think the DS version of the story is that much better. If you are not aware, the original Famicom version just had 4 Warriors of Light with no particular background or names. In the DS version, those characters have some default names, they have character attributes which make them unique, and I think that adds a little bit to the script and the story. It makes you feel like there's something there that's a little bit more substantial than the original Famicom version and the original 2 Final Fantasy games. Final Fantasy III uses a larger and perhaps more sweeping and epic approach to the technique used in the first 2 games, which is that you start in a smaller, isolated area where there's a conflict that's fairly local to the area that you're in, and as you progress through that little bit of the story, you get exposed to the larger conflict, and you move on to a new area where there's another small conflict and gain another little piece of the whole. So as you go through each little area, you get a better idea of how the world works and how everything's put together and what the overall conflict is. The setting really starts in this small floating continent. You don't realize that it's a floating continent at first, but as you go through the various little levels, eventually you are opened up to an entirely new and gigantic world beneath that you unlock, and then you get to go on adventures in. So just really when you think that the game is maybe drawing to its conclusion, it doubles or triples in size. And that, I think, was a really great effect for story. The story ends up feeling really epic that way. You have elements to the setting which you will find in other Final Fantasy games, airships, crystals which have to be either fixed or planted or gathered on some capacity, and even the idea of a cycle occurring between light and dark, something that Sakaguchi explores further in other Final Fantasy games as the series goes on. Also present in other Final Fantasy games, which is in this one, is the idea of trying to stop the cycle of time and free yourself from mortality and from the unavoidable conclusions of that cyclical nature of time. I'll talk more about that in just a minute, but let's move on to characters, because I think this is where the DS version, like I said, really improves over the original, is that those 4 characters, even though you can name them, they have personalities of their own, and they roughly approximate some familiar character archetypes. You have Luneth, who's the first character you gain control over, which my chat named Mel for my playthrough. He's like your classic brave hero, your foolhardy Luke Skywalker type of hero's journey hero. You have Ark, his best friend, who is also a foil against him. He's less brave and he's more smart. This is a really typical arrangement, as you have a hero and then his best friend really kind of represents the opposite. You have Frodo, who's very smart. You have Sam, who's very simple. And that works really well with Luneth and Ark. You have Refia, who's the only female character, and she really is the goody two-shoes of the bunch. She's constantly berating the other members of the party for being foolhardy or for doing things she doesn't like having to be turned into a toad. She's a classic goody two-shoes character, similar to, say, Hermione in a Harry Potter book. The last one is Ingus, who's a more noble and competent kind of character, a character that's supposed to be a little bit more dashing and a little bit more experienced, and I think he fits and rounds off the cast pretty well. The party is also joined by support characters that come and go. These are often in a more teacher role or like Paragon role, depending on what character is there. They help the party, they guide the party to the next goal, and then they depart from the party, often having to sacrifice themselves or die in the process. This is something that Sakaguchi uses frequently in the Final Fantasy series, and to really great effect, I think, in Final Fantasy IV, which we will talk about next month. One thing I did like about the appearance of these characters is that while they are there and helping your party, they are not part of the party, which is different from Final Fantasy II. In Final Fantasy II, they enter your party, you control them, then they leave your party, taking your equipment with you. I think it would have disturbed the meta too much to have these characters leaving and coming in all the time. And that is something that you get in Final Fantasy IV. In fact, that's the way that they shake up your class makeup in Final Fantasy IV. But in Final Fantasy III, because the meta is all about how you decide what your jobs are going to be for your characters, I think it's really good that these helper characters don't actually come in and disturb any of that. You can set your characters up with a good party and expect it to stick while these characters come in and out. All right, moving on to plot. I mentioned that the main purpose of the story is really to shuffle the player through various set pieces, get them into new environments and exploring and experiencing new things. That is true, and therefore the plot format is what I call the Odyssey format, or an episodic adventure. That is, each little area you go to is a new episode. There's a new conflict that has to be resolved and a new set of goals for each area that you have to fulfill in order to complete your objectives and move on to the next area. And then in each one of these areas, you're given a little piece of the entire plot, which helps you to have some forward momentum, in some sense that everything you're doing is contributing to the whole. What's great about this format, if you're doing a game like this, is that if you're running out of time during development, you can always cut a chapter out and you're not really going to lose anything. Because each little area is separate from each other area, it doesn't feel quite so linear. Each little area feels like its own little complete story. The people in one village need you to go to the Golden Palace and defeat the guy who's hoarding all the gold. Or you have to catch the floating tree and stop the evil skeleton king from trying to take over the floating continent. Each of these little stories feels like its own little thing, and that's great. I think it also helps to break up a game like this, which is very long. So you're always feeling interested in wherever you are in the game and whatever you're doing, because there's an immediate conflict that has to be resolved. The main plot revolves around this antagonist who is discovered to be a character named Xandi, who's one of these 3 very powerful ancient mages who themselves were disciples of an even greater mage named Noah. And his gift from this great mage Noah was the gift of mortality, which is a very interesting idea. But he doesn't like this gift. So similar to Chaos in the first Final Fantasy game, he's trying to stop time so that he can have the immortality that his fellow magi have. And one thing that's done in this game, which is done in lots of other Final Fantasy games, is that once you get to the main antagonist and are able to confront him and defeat him, there's an even bigger and more prescient god-level threat that emerges as a result of that character's actions. Xandi, by attempting to freeze time, upsets the balance between light and dark, and darkness is threatening to overtake the world and destroy it. So the final boss is the Cloud of Darkness, and in fact, you have to journey into the parallel world of darkness and defeat that Cloud of Darkness using the help of the 4 warriors, not of the light, but of the dark, which you discover is a thing as you go through the course of the game. And those warriors of the dark basically did what you're doing, but an inversion of it. There was too much light pouring into the world of darkness, and it upset the balance. So this balance between light and dark, the cyclical nature of time, the attempt to freeze time to achieve some sort of immortality, these are themes that were present in the original Final Fantasy game, and here they have a new iteration and new life and some really unexpected twists when you get to that final world of darkness. That is, by the way, the longest and most challenging dungeon is to do this tower and then the final world of darkness, all without saving the game. I managed to do it, and it was very satisfying to finally kill the Cloud of Darkness after all that effort and finish a very epic chapter of the game. It definitely helps with the newer version that I was playing on the PlayStation Vita, where I could just put the system into sleep mode and pick back up later, or even create a save state using Adrenaline. If you don't have a hacked Vita, you can run Adrenaline and create save states. Very helpful so that you don't have to do that entire dungeon in one sitting. You can imagine trying to do that on the Famicom. It would be quite a brutal undertaking. So that is another benefit of the newer version of the game. So that's my analysis of the game. I really enjoyed playing it, and I loved playing it on stream. It was definitely a lot of fun to interact with people as I played through the game. One of the more epic Final Fantasy games of the early games in the series because of how many different set pieces it has, how many different little stories, and just how much there is to explore with the job system. I do recommend it, especially for anybody who's a fan of classic JRPGs and wants to play the game that really bridged the gap between the original design elements of the first 2 Final Fantasy games for the Famicom and what you got with Final Fantasy IV, a very story-driven experience. Overall, I give it an 8.5 out of 10, and I would totally replay it. This is the second time I've played the DS version. I played the original DS version way back in 2006, so it was really like a brand new experience for me because I haven't played it in so many years at this point. So I do recommend it, and maybe you'll think about checking it out if you enjoy the graphics that you've probably seen on your screen while listening to this, and you would like to experience that job system and have fun experimenting with that. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And of course, you can find more of my books at dvspress.com and read more of my blog content over there. And I will see you all next time.